Welcome back.
אז אנחנו חוזרים.
So we are back to our seat about the new Haredim, the new ultra-Orthodox. I invite Dr. Yonyen, the chairman of the panel, to present the speakers. Yes.
איפה זה מאוד טוב?
רגע, אנחנו...
לא, הסרט הוא מצוין, שבמדינה הזאת,
רגע.
כולם נאבדות לי, בורחות לי, אני ישן.
אוקיי. יעניין, בבקשה.
Thank you, Inbar. Shalom לכולם. Okay, now in this panel, the new Haredim, we will have four scholars to share with us their research. The first scholar is Dr. Lee Cahaner. She is from Israel Democracy Institute and Oranim Academic College of Education. And her topic of the presentation is who are the modern Haredim? So let's welcome Dr. Cahaner.
Lee Cahaner, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well, Inbal? Yes, and we can see you well as well. So thank you, Yanyan and Sima and Inbal, for the invitation to come and speak in the conference. And the question I was asked to answer in the conference are, who are the modern Haredi? And it's almost for a decade that I've been attempting to address this question with the research that has been published in 2012 with Dr. Chaim Zicherman. And he asked how the Haredi middle class has developed in Israel. A group of researchers came from the Israeli Democracy Institute that looked at the Haredi population from different perspectives. Dr. Anat Bahad here wrote about the Haredi middle class in relations to their divorce rate and the status. There is the educational aspects and others. The recent project was published as a book in 2020, and it tries to place the modern Haredi groups on the axis between conservatism and modernism. Somewhat like Sima had presented in her opening lecture. When we look at the Haredi society, we can see that in terms of the data, in 2020, we're talking about 1,200,000 Haredis in Israel in 2025 years, according to forecasts of the Israeli Statistics Bureau. There'll be 3 million Haredi, and in 2060, there'll be 6 million Haredi in Israel. The main question is, what will be the character of the Haredi population in Israel? And the series of lectures, including the opening remarks of the conference, look towards changes of the mainstreams of the Haredi population. Now, I want to ask, will the working modern Haredi population seek the connection with the Israeli mainstream population have an opening status, a pretty good opening status after the Meron crisis and the COVID pandemic and other crises that we'll talk about. When we look at the Haredi population from the establishment of the state, we see three generations of ultra-Orthodox religiousness. The first generation after the Second World War was integrating with the population. The men and women did work. It was a generation of survivors that came up from the dust. After that generation, the Haredi leadership began to establish the more conservative Torah learning population and a whole world of education systems and yeshivas was built to be the second generation of the conservative ultra-Orthodox society. So the second generation is segregational, conservative. It peaked in the establishment of a separate educational system and establishing of separate Haredi populations. The fertility rate for Haredi women averaged on 8 children per woman, and that's, of course, a high number. The state, and it was said in the political discourse, the state provided funds to the Haredi population in order to conserve its structure. The third generation was pushed towards change since the beginning of the 2000s on 3 main categories. The first categories includes economic changes that push mainly the men, but also the women of the Haredi population to the labor market. The second shift has to do with the leadership transitioning leadership in the Haredi population. And despite the highly authoritativeness of the Haredi population, this is a time of new voices in this context. And the third category of changes are cultural changes that have to do with employment, the academy, the internet that is introduced, and the consumer culture. I want to connect to the lectures that were presented and will be presented. When we're talking about economic changes, we talk about the descent of the economic superpowers, a global economy crisis that also impacted the Haredi population because they live on contributions from these populations. We want to ask what will happen after COVID? Will we see more Haredis entering the labor market, and how will it impact the main groups in that society? The other, the changes that the second generation, third generation is pushed towards has allowed us to look differently at the identity and ethnic identity of the Haredi populations. When we looked in the past about the Hasidis and the various yeshivas, we've heard a thesis about the Eastern ultra-Orthodox that are softer Haredim, and we've heard about the characteristics of the Hasidic groups. And when we talk about the variety of identities in the Haredi population, we will hear from Dr. Shlomi Doron about those who return to the religious identity. And I want to present another axis between conservative and modernism within the Haredi population. Of course, this does not render the other axis of identity redundant. It crosses them and integrates the interfaces with them. In 2013, there was a first attempt to quantify these groups. And in the work done, we found that 70% belong to the mainstream Haredi population. Sima noted this and will define it again. And 30% are beyond the mainstream ultra-Orthodox population, but they relate to the modernistic world in their internet use and entrance to the labor market. Now, in 2013, we talked about 3 to 7% modern Haredi, and we'll define that. In the recent research work that I've presented here, I found 4 groups. 2 groups are clearly more conservative and are the mainstream of the ultra-Orthodox population. From them, there are small groups of extremists. And there is the group, if you see the 61% in the center, the modern ultra-Orthodox can be counted within the mainstream, and we've got another sector of modern populations, modern Haredi population. these two groups of 60% of the mainstream Haredi population, we see them all the time. This is the critical mass. These are groups that live in separate neighborhoods, separate cities. Even they send their children to the Orthodox educational system. They completely identify with the central and mainstream Haredi ideology, and they follow each their own leaders in the mainstream population, and they're true to their leaders despite the crisis, and they're true to Haredi politics. The most interesting and complex groups are those that have touches of modern Haredis. On the one hand, they're very conservative. On the other hand, they're more open than the mainstream. And they also have more conservative and more model practices. They are a group of inherent dissonance. And it's very interesting, not because of the dissonance, but because it's willingness to live in the middle of the Haredi society, to be in the midst, to have matchmaking with the mainstream Haredi society, to send their children to the mainstream educational institutions. And that is why their location is interesting. They seek to be in the middle among the mainstream Haredi population. The fourth group is the modern Haredi population. It has practices, open practices and perceptives in comparison with the mainstream Haredi population. And they also seek to be both. They seek to be part of the mainstream Israeli society and also part of the mainstream Haredi population and sphere. And after this backdrop, I will ask, who are the modern Haredis? First of all, their source, their origin comes from three main spheres. The first is the Poalei Agudat Israel. When the state was established, it was already an Orthodox group that says Torah and work. We are ultra-Orthodox, but we work. And we are Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, but we also settle the land. And this group also preserved its ethos in the working modern Haredi population. Another axis of origin is the ultra-Orthodox populations from overseas. They intermarry, and they also immigrate to Israel from London, from Belgium, from Israel. They naturally bring the discourse of this and that as well. I'm ultra-Orthodox, but I work in the US. I'm ultra-Orthodox, but I live in London. And of course I work in London, because who will finance me if not? So the discourse is incorporating from both worlds, the ultra-Orthodox world and the global Western world. And the third axis is the class axis. On the one hand, there are groups in modern or ultra-Orthodox groups are from higher classes. On the other hand, these are groups that come from the mainstream Haredi population. They have recently been immigrating into the Haredi middle class, into working groups in the Haredi population. Now, when we seek to characterize these groups, the recent work that has been done is statistical, but I was asked to give here a general view. When we try to characterize the modern Haredi, then we see men and women within these groups are academically educated, or at least have professional education. They mostly are free professionals. They deal in high tech, media, law, military service is interesting. If they do military service, they do that in order to enter and penetrate the labor market. We don't see, though, an increase in the military service among the Haredi population. These groups consume Western modern lifestyle. They do sports. They vacation in Israel and abroad. They are characterized by standard middle class characteristic. The fertility rate is between 4 and 5 children in comparison to the mainstream Haredi population that have 7 to 8 children on average. And the last point is this spatial context. They aspire to live in integrated mixed spheres and neighborhoods. Some of them lived on the border of the Haredi and secular populations and neighborhoods, but most of them live in the midst of the secular neighborhoods, and they manage their lives also without the Haredi sphere. So they live Haredi life as well as the secular life. They are part of the mainstream Haredi sphere and also the mainstream Israeli secular sphere. It's interesting because we are asked, methodologically speaking, also, are we talking about Haredis, about ultra-Orthodox? Yes, we are indeed talking about Haredis. All the three first slides are based, that presented statistical data are based on self-questionnaires. Now, they all define themselves as Haredis, and they have constant communication with the mainstream Haredi population. I want to present, I hope I have time. I want to present a quote that one of the participants in the respondents of the interviews said when he was asked whether he is Haredi. And he said, the question of self-identity is complex. I'm a sort of lonely wolf. There was an age that bothered me more. Today, I don't have a problem with that. At the end of the question of self-identity exists all the day. At the end of the day, I'll say that I'm Haredi, but the question of identity bothers me because towards the mainstream Haredi, I'm not Haredi, but I don't identify with others groups. I'm bothered by the topic of self-identity, but I hope my children will have it easier. So I do have the cycle of military service here, but we see that this is not the greatest catalysator of formulating the modern working Haredi population. The main catalysator is based on a high quality occupational market penetration into the academy. If there'll be significant educational institutions that will be appropriate for the spirit of these populations, that will also be a catalysator of growth. We have exposure to the internet and consumer culture, and also they are disappointed from the mainstream Haredi population. It doesn't mean that they will not be religious anymore, or will not have faith, or will not be Haredi anymore, but within their identity as Haredis, they will shift. We are witnessing a shift of location. Now, maybe one of the main challenges of modern Haredi life are three lacunas. The first challenge is the lack of educational systems throughout the educational continuum from the primary school, high school, and at the academy. The lack of significant spiritual leadership, although recently we have heard voices that are raising the flag of modern Haredi population. And the third lacuna is the lack of significant political leadership, although we have heard new voices, but still the loyalty of modern working Haredi population is still to the mainstream Haredi parties. And it's interesting because the Haredi parties are very right wings, and it's interesting to see where the modern Haredi population will tend. Again, I want to repeat the lacuna in educational institutions. The modern Haredis raise a generation that listens to full voices. One voice is from home. We are working, but we are Haredis. We live uh, in an integrated life with the mainstream secular society. And on the other hand, we have the educational system, which is very conservative. Now, the question is whether in the lack of educational institutions that follow the spirit of this group, what will turn out? We have asked two questions throughout the recent decade, actually a decade before the recent decade. The question was, what will be the impact of working life and modern Haredism on the mainstream Haredi populations? And we've marked three scenarios. First of all, a complete rejection and combatants against the modern Haredi population. Second, ignorance or lack of reaction. And the third one is integration. Now, we've seen the three scenarios play out. First of all, we've seen the impact of the modern working Haredi on the mainstream and containment of the modern Haredi in the mainstream society. Now, when we look at this from the Israeli secular eyes, it's more disappointing to see what happened with these groups and the Israeli society, because the middle class Haredi population has a chance of creating a moderate discourse or a shared discourse with the secular society, but we have not witnessed this. The question is whether it's too survival focused. Is it constructing new ways of life and a new mechanisms of society, and whether it's too self-absorbed and occupied with its survival to integrate and indeed present a new value towards the secular Israeli society. I think that it did not yet happen because these groups are just consolidating themselves, but they are growing in numbers, and therefore they could potentially provide or serve as a bridge between the Haredi population and the Israeli secular population. And I have to say that the state has to be an active part in supporting and consolidating the new and modern Haredi population. It has to do with occupation and especially higher education. And of course, the complexity of the Haredi population has a lot of impact because they have to move on the axis between individuality and society and collectivism. Now, to conclude, COVID had left us with central and crucial questions regarding the working Haredi population, whether there'll be penetration, a greater penetration into the labor market. Will they, the internet use has risen in dozens of percentages among the Haredi society, and that has a lot of implication. And I think the most challenging thing for the modern Haredi population is what Professor Uriah said in the beginning of the conference, is the struggle between the Haredi population and the secular population in Israel, because the Haredi population need to survive on the border. They need support from the secular society, and they need not to be pushed back to the mainstream Haredi population. And the recent year has been difficult in these terms. I'll just leave these questions with you. The question of value is central. Do we aspire to central values, or do we allow these groups to move on the axis versus the axis of complementary segregation? Yair maybe will answer the next question. Where does this story stand in the perspective of history? And we were asking about the identity of the next generation of modern working Haredi, because right now it's a generation that speaks in many languages. They want to remain in the Haredi sphere, and they don't have educational or spiritual or political institutions that will lead them forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee Cahaner.